This is Kass, the traveling Rito bard from Breath of the Wild, dedicated to studying music. And this is Kass in Tears of the Kingdom. Notice anything strange? What about this? Could you differentiate from these two videos which is Breath of the Wild and which is Tears of the Kingdom? Of course you couldn't, because it's a trick question. These two videos are taken from the same game, because Kass is actually not in Tears of the Kingdom at all. But why? He was a fan favorite and became one of the most iconic characters in the entire Zelda series, and then 5 years later, he suddenly disappeared off the face of Hyrule without a trace. Not only that, we are also going to be solving the mystery of every single disappearance in Tears of the Kingdom. To do this, we're going to be finding the answers to two questions in particular. Where did these things go, and why did they disappear? Little did I know that this was going to be one of the most time-consuming projects I had ever done, because not only did the developers give no hints on where everything went, there was also very little in-game evidence that I could use to draw conclusions from. But with that out of the way, this is the mystery behind Tears of the Kingdom's unexplained disappearances. As we already know, our first disappearance pertains to the Rito NPC from Breath of the Wild, Kass. For context, in Breath of the Wild, we can meet Kass shortly after completing the Great Plateau, at which point he and Link have no sort of acquaintance whatsoever. However, Kass seems to recognize the sheika slate that Link is carrying. He then introduces himself to Link and asks if he has heard of the ancient songs. He goes on to explain that the ancient songs are dedicated to the ancient hero who defeated Calamity Ganon 10,000 years ago. Kass was seen as a traveling Rito bard dedicated to studying music. His late teacher taught him the many songs of Hyrule, and Kass analyzed the songs extensively. Kass wouldn't just study the notes being played, he would also look into the lyrics of each song and what they symbolized. Kass could be found at many different locations across the map, at which Link and Kass had several interactions. Kass would present Link with one of the songs from his late teacher, which related to some physical attribute to the land around them. However, behind each song was a puzzle, and Link would then have to analyze the lyrics to find the solution to uncover a shrine. Kass also had an important role in the DLC, specifically the Champion's Ballad. In fact, the reason why it's called the Champion's Ballad is because of Kass, which makes his disappearance all the more confusing. In Breath of the Wild, we also meet Kass's family of a wife and 5 children, who all still reside in Rito Village. However, in Tears of the Kingdom, Kass is the only one missing. Kass became a fan favorite in Breath of the Wild, which understandably upset quite a few people when he did not make an appearance in Tears of the Kingdom, especially since there was such a lack of evidence of where he went, which also caused a lot of different questions and theories on Kass's whereabouts. It is important to note that Tears of the Kingdom makes very few references at all to Kass himself, let alone his whereabouts, so we have to base this off mostly information from Breath of the Wild. Before we do that, however, let's go over the few pieces of evidence pertaining to Kass in Tears of the Kingdom. In Tears of the Kingdom, the obvious first place to look for Kass is to ask his family members, who still live in Rito Village. After exhausting every single dialogue option with each member, none of them mentioned Kass a single time. This may seem like a dead end, but I will soon explain why this is actually a huge clue to finding where Kass truly is. Next, Pen mentions Kass during the Lucky Clover Gazette questline, and I quote, "A famous bard once perfected his craft in this place, studying the songs of this land. I'll stay here just like him and look out across the land. I'll get in touch with my reporting instinct." While helpful to a certain degree, we can't consider this source to be very reliable or useful for a few reasons. Now, this source is a primary one, meaning that it is Pen's eyewitness account. However, Pen doesn't provide any clear-cut proof that he is in fact talking about Kass, and it isn't useful because this quote is highly likely to be referring to Kass's role in Breath of the Wild, which doesn't help us here. The final piece of evidence from Tears of the Kingdom is a dialogue interaction with Toro, who is a member of the Zonai research team. Toro makes a possible reference to one of Kass's songs during the investigation of the Kakariko Zonai ruins. "I heard a song that once compared the Chikozu River to a forest dragon. Could that be related?" Again, another primary source, And Kass did have a song about Chukozu River in Breath of the Wild, but we cannot use this because of the same reasons we used previously. There is no direct referencing of Kass, and the information is still related to what Kass did in Breath of the Wild. Now let's move on to the different pieces of evidence from Breath of the Wild that could hopefully point us in the right direction. In Breath of the Wild, we can have unique dialogue interactions with Kass after completing his shrine quests available. When spoken to at Rito's stable, Kass will confess that he is homesick. He admits that he had to leave his wife Amali and their children behind when he set out on his journey, and he hopes they are doing well. However, he reveals that he is unable to return until he fulfills his promise to his late teacher. When Link asks about his promise, Kass will begin to explain, but he then decides now is not the best time to reveal his promise. He tells Link that after he learns all of the ancient songs, he will share his promise with him in Rito Village. He will then reside in Rito Village, in which he shares some interesting information about Link and Zelda, and more importantly, some evidence that could point us in the right direction of where Kass might be in Tears of the Kingdom. We learn that Kass has now studied all music from the land of Hyrule, and thus was in search of new music to study. He mentions a very important detail that states that he wants to move on to different lands to find new music, which means that his intention was to travel to different lands even before Tears of the Kingdom was in the picture. Additionally, this is a very useful and reliable source which we can use to draw a few conclusions from. Firstly, this information is coming from Kass himself, so there's no possibility of the evidence to be untrue or subject to bias, and it also disproves a highly speculated theory the community had thought of. These few pieces of evidence all point away from the one conclusion that a lot of fans were speculating, which was that Kass is dead. The most definitive pieces of evidence that support this are his family members and from Kass himself. None of them mention a single thing about Kass, which means that his disappearance can't be something as traumatic as death, because then his family would be concerned for why he would be missing or simply mourning the passing of their loved one. Additionally, we learn from Breath of the Wild that Kass was already intending on leaving Hyrule in the first place, so this is a massive indicator that Kass is simply traveling to new lands. We can deduce this because in Breath of the Wild, we know that he is a traveling bard and that he wanted to constantly travel different lands to find new music. Of course, we can only base this off evidence, but the community has also come up with several other theories on Kass's whereabouts, and here is the best one that I found. This theory was taken from an Outsider Gamer article, in which it states that Kass could possibly be in hiding since the upheaval. This can be seen by the natural disasters that the upheaval brought upon Hyrule, specifically the constant blizzard over Rito Village. Kass could also be threatened by the awakening of the Demon King and thus is in hiding to protect himself. In the end, I think the Zelda team were forced to scrap Kass because of one big reason. Breath of the Wild was so successful that people would correlate a lot of the characters to that game. Thus, if Kass were brought into Tears of the Kingdom, people would have likely complained that Tears was too similar to Breath of the Wild. After making this decision, it would usually mean that developers would put some sort of explanation in place to justify his disappearance, but since there isn't one and his family is still present, it makes the dynamic very strange to say the least. However, what a lot of people noticed is that the developers saw the potential that Kass held, so they brought in a new character to take his place, being Pen. The similarities between these two are quite obvious at surface level, being that they are both Rito and that they can both be found at multiple different locations across Hyrule. Our second disappearance pertains to the array of sheika technology from Breath of the Wild. The sheika were a tribe of individuals not too dissimilar to that of Hylians. Where they differ from the Hylians was in their mythological abilities and their advanced intelligence. Hyrule was industrializing quickly, and the sheika thought it was wise to put their intelligence to good use. They decided to construct the many towers, the guardians, and the divine beasts. All of these creations were made to ensure the safety of Hyrule in anticipation of Ganon's eventual resurface. The guardians were autonomous robots with laser reticles, made to target any enemy. The divine beasts were huge mechanical machines that were piloted by a hand-picked warrior. Divine Beast Var Meadow, piloted by a Rito. Divine Beast Var Naboris, piloted by a Gerudo. Divine Beast Var Ruta, piloted by a Zora, and Divine Beast Var Rudania, piloted by a Goron. The sheika also constructed the 136 ancient shrines, the sheika slate being Link's only source of mythological abilities, the Shrine of Resurrection, which was the sole reason Link didn't die after getting gravely injured during the Calamity, and the DLC dungeon which allowed Link to access the Master Cycle. The Sheikah used this technology to easily destroy Calamity Ganon 10,000 years ago, as the divine beasts and guardians paved the way for the ancient hero and the princess to seal Ganon away deep under Hyrule Castle. Fast forward 10,000 years or so, and Ganon's resurface had been prophesied to come very soon. The Hylians were at a loss for what to do, and thus ordered the excavation of all the divine beasts and guardians that were previously buried 10,000 years ago. With the excavation, the people of Hyrule expected another easy victory. However, they underestimated Ganon's ability to learn from his previous mistakes. Calamity Ganon resurfaces and recognizes the same technology that bested him 10,000 years prior. To combat this, he takes control of all the guardians and the divine beasts, turning them against their creators. Chaos ensues and razes Hyrule to the ground. That event is now known as the Great Calamity, or the destruction of Hyrule. The Sheikah technology made up a large portion of the story in Breath of the Wild, and also had many different side quests pertaining to it, and became a point of interest whenever I would see a structure with an orange glow in the distance. Also, the Sheikah Slate being responsible for all of Link's abilities, being able to fast travel, look at quests, take photos, and look at the map, made the Sheikah technology an integral part of the gameplay mechanics in Breath of the Wild, which made it all the more confusing on how it mysteriously vanished without a trace and seemingly no explanation. The reason I say seemingly is because the developer of Tears gave us an explanation of exactly where they went, and I quote, "They disappeared after the Calamity was defeated. All of the people of Hyrule also witnessed this, but there is no one who knows the mechanism or reason why they disappeared, and it is considered a mystery. It is believed that since the Calamity disappeared, they also disappeared as their role had been fulfilled." Now, this is both a really idiotic and reasonable explanation for why the tech disappeared. I'll first explain why it is reasonable. In Breath of the Wild, when Link completes a shrine, the Sheikah monk inside seems to magically vanish into thin air, so it could make sense on how the shrines, towers, and guardians did the same thing. However, I find this explanation really idiotic because of a few reasons. If all the technology seemingly disappeared, how come there is still a decayed guardian on top of the Hateno ancient tech lab? How was there still leftover Sheikah tech which allowed the construction of the Puripad and the Skyview towers? Additionally, the Sheikah's inventions were not made in anticipation of a threat. It was to keep the peace of Hyrule. So it makes no sense how if there was no threat, they would just vanish, which leaves the kingdom open to another threat, which it very clearly was in Tears of the Kingdom. I don't think the developers actually put any thought into why the Sheikah tech should disappear from a backstory point of view, but rather only supported the decision on the positive effects it would have on gameplay. So when journalists came around asking questions, they decided to give an answer which doesn't really provide any closure to theorists, which wasn't even backed by substantial reasoning. Since this is such a lackluster explanation, let's look at one theory that is much more plausible and is my personal favorite. Ganondorf. Ganon did take control of the Sheikah technology, which did give him a temporary victory during the Calamity. However, Link still became victorious in sealing Ganon away. He did so by using Sheikah technology. Firstly, Link wouldn't be alive in the first place if it hadn't been for the Shrine of Resurrection, which was built by the Sheikah. Secondly, Link wouldn't have had any abilities if it weren't for the Sheikah Slate. Link wouldn't have regained his strength and stamina if it weren't for the Sheikah Shrines, and Link was able to liberate the divine beasts from Ganon's control, which led to his demise. The Sheikah created these weapons over 10,000 years ago, which helped them destroy Ganon during that war. However, Ganon learned, and once he resurfaced, he took control of Hyrule's biggest asset. Thus, when Link was able to use more Sheikah tech to beat Ganon once again, it's likely that he learned from this and also saw the Sheikah tech as a liability. Despite his efforts, he was still unable to best the inventions of the Sheikah, so when Link and Zelda discover Ganon's mummified body, it is entirely possible that Ganon disintegrated all Sheikah tech during the upheaval. After all, Ganondorf was the source of gloom, and gloom almost completely disintegrated the Master Sword after only being exposed to it for a few seconds, keeping in mind that the Master Sword is quite literally the sword that seals the darkness. Thus, destroying the Sheikah tech would be extremely easy, and we can support this theory with one major piece of evidence. If you go to many of the previous shrine locations from Breath of the Wild, you will see that exactly where they used to stand, a chasm has now taken its place, meaning that Ganon could have destroyed them in order to prevent Link using them to his advantage. With all that said, this is just one of the many different mysteries behind Tears of the Kingdom, so if you want me to make more videos like these, make sure to stick around because that will be a story for another video.